Father Mark Lowell Sargent is the former ecumenical director of his Catholic diocese and is currently responsible for relations between the Catholic and Muslim communities in southwestern Ontario. Sargent, who is an expert on Islam and is part of a joint American-Canadian team employed by the U.S. Army to prepare deploying troops for duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. After being honorably released from active duty, Sargent returned to the Diocese of London, Ontario, and chaired the World Youth Day involving some 25,000 international youth traveling to see the Pope. He was also assigned as the executive coordinator of the National Federation of Priest Councils, a national organization that works with the bishops of Canada to ensure the welfare, continuing education, and development of the clergy. He has also been appointed to several boards, in particular the board of the South Down Institute. Having joined the Canadian Armed Forces Reserve at an early age, Sargent began his career as a private soldier and was eventually promoted to major. He has the distinction of having served in all three branches of the Armed Forces, Canadian Armed Forces. His operational tours include the Arctic, Norway, Somalia, the former Republic of Yugoslavia, and South Africa. He was ordained to the priesthood in May 1987 for the Diocese of London. Sargent received a BA in History and Philosophy and a Master of Divinity from the University of Western Ontario. He's a native of St. Thomas, Ontario. I met Father Sargent actually as part of this team that speaks to U.S. troops deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan. And he gives the Islam brief to all troops going overseas. And I was really impressed with his stories from Somalia and Bosnia and different places that I had put a little time in, but he had put extensive time in. And his view of those conflicts and in those world hotspots as a man of faith. And he also had a very good sense of humor. It was very funny. So I just realized that I felt it to be a pleasure to have him here at BYU, and so we started talking to Corey about it. So I won't say any more than that. I'll let him speak for himself, but it is my pleasure to introduce Father Sargent and to have him come here today to lecture to us. Thank you. Father Sargent.
I would as well like to thank the Institute for their warm and very, very hospitable welcome. Et aussi pour la conduite hier soir. Je dis bonjour à Barbara. Vous êtes une très bonne ambassadrice pour la fidélité mormone et la communauté mormone. Merci. I'm a Canadian, and we do that all the time. It's okay. I think it I will be honest, my work with the Mormon community has essentially just consisted of offering sandwich and postum to missionaries who come to my door, and my roommate when I lived in Calgary. I was an officer in a unit there. The house I shared with another Mormon fellow who was very much struggling with his identity as a member of the Mormon community, and I as a priest, and how do I support him. So I consider it a rare and very distinguished pleasure, Corey, to be invited here today to talk about faith and war and these things that we struggle with as men and women of faith. I want to begin rather oddly by first of all saying that I have a deep and abiding faith in Jesus Christ. I am in fact a Christian, very devoted to my church and its policies in the world and its history, but I am also a free-thinking man of conscience. And God asks all of us, first and foremost, to form our conscience in the light of various truths. And so I want to frame today's talk by, as always, whenever we enter into a dialectic, by distinguishing terms. And I want to talk about two terms in particular that we're going to use this afternoon in this lecture that will have a common definition. So we can, whether you agree with it or not, I don't really care, but it's the definition that I'm going to use. I want to first of all talk about the word faith. Faith is a gift from God, and that it is a personal relationship that illuminates truth, and faith illuminates justice, and it illuminates peace. Faith prepares us to receive the gospel. That's faith. Religion, where faith is more an interior relationship with God, religion is that exterior relationship or an expression of that faith. Religion answers questions like, who is God? Who am I? How do I please this deity we call God? How do I incur God's pleasure? And how do I deter God from smiting me? So that religion is very anthropomorphic. Is that an okay word to use? Religion makes the unintelligible intelligible. It allows me to see it and to experience it. Now, what that also means, so that we're clear, it is possible to have faith and not religion, and it is also possible for many people who have great religions to have no faith. They are not synonymous. And we should never equate people who use religious language and religious monikers as people of faith. And we should not be overtly confused and upset when we see people who seem to have great faith but are not of our religion. Is that okay as a beginning point? Okay, no one's head has exploded, so I'll keep going on then. So that I think that in the ideal world, there would be a great connection between faith and religion and faith. That in the world that we would all like to see at the coming of Christ, that will probably happen. But the world that we live in today is one that does not know that reality. And so when we look at the great realities of the world we live in, one of them, and the one that we're going to concentrate for a bit on today, is war. And how religion and faith and war all get seemingly mixed up with one another. Now, I grew up in a very conservative area of the world. I'm going to go off camera. Just so you know, this bit of ice and snow north of you is actually a country. And this is the part that I live in, down in the south. A very bigoted little community, where in my father's day, when he converted to Catholicism to marry my mother, 24 hours later he lost his job, because you couldn't work for the railway and be a Catholic. And when my father married my mother, there's these great pictures from the church balcony looking down, and on my mother's side of the church are about 150 guests and all the appropriate attendants. And on my father's side of the church, there is my father, his best man, and his mother. No one came, not even his own father. And so I learned at a very early age that religions were things that really upset people. And religions were things that caused great divisions in families. And that religion was not something that was always going to be a unifying factor, but something that was in fact quite divisive. And that I also learned around the kitchen table that religious intolerance got you the back of the spoon across the forehead. To make a religious joke, to make fun of someone else's religion or faith, was a punishable offense in my family. After I sort of looked around the little community I lived in, the reality that I was faced with when I was about 14 or 15 was that I was either going to work on a farm or work in an automobile factory. That's what you do in southwestern Ontario. And so wanting to get out and sort of see the world, I joined the Army Reserve, and then from there, our regular army. And all through it, I kind of thought about being a priest. Now, I've learned today that there's probably only priests sitting in this room and probably a couple bishops, so fathers and excellencies, I salute you all. But in my limited understanding of what it is to be a priest, called by God, and you go through 7 years of seminary, and then the bishop finally recognizes the call, and hands are laid upon you, and you're made a deacon and then priest, and you serve within a community. I had thought God was calling me, but didn't really want to, because I enjoy the company of women. I might have enjoyed a family, but in the Roman Catholic understanding of priesthood, it is a celibate priesthood. And so we forego that for the good of the kingdom. That's the religion, and in faith we believe that to be true. And so I said, well, I'm tired of digging holes in the army, and those people that don't dig holes are traditionally officers. So I want to become an officer because I'm tired of digging. So I need a degree. So the plan was, between myself and God, I would go 1 year to seminary. And seminary is where we train men, but it's also where you get your first undergraduate degree. I would go 1 year in the seminary, get rid of this stupid feeling that I really want to be a priest, and then transfer to the main campus of the university, finish my degree, become an officer, and never dig a hole again, and get lots of money and live a wonderful life, having satisfied God and man. Well, the wheels fell off the plan, and 7 years later, I was ordained a priest because I could find no reason as to why I should leave, and every reason in faith why I should stay. And it was a difficult thing, because I had my plan and what I was going to do, and my world, and the area that I came from, and God spoke very powerfully and said, I have something else. I did very well as a civilian priest until one day when my bishop called me. And as Roman Catholics, we have vows of obedience. And a vow of obedience is not an intellectual exercise where someone suggests something you might like to do. It's simply, hello, Father Mark, it's the bishop. Yes, bishop. I'm sending you next month to the military. Here's a phone number you have to call. Thank you. And he hangs up the phone. And that's that easy. So the will of God for me now is to go to the military, which was a nice fit because I had been a soldier. So I went with all my bright-eyed, bushy-tailed ideals into the military, and within months found myself in the midst of Somalia. I think in seminary we do a lot of study around evil in the world and what war is and how glorious they are or what it can do to countries and nations. But it wasn't until I was halfway through my first war that I realized that war is in fact a great theological reality. It has political connotations, but in fact, war is evil run amok. It is Satan. If God is the presence of order in creation, then the absence of not that there can be an absence of God, but that which works against God is disorder and chaos, which is war. I mean, war exists simply to crush and to destroy and to annihilate. Nothing really good comes from it. Oh, we have nice inventions. We can say this fabric was developed for the military or this particular widget was invented for the military. But it destroys, in the most brutal and horrible fashion, millions of people. And I don't think necessarily that that has much to do with the will of God, more with the power of evil within the world we live in. Anyway, I found Somalia to be, in every instance of the word, this great and vast experience of what evil could be. Imagine a society, if you can, where there is no law, there is no order, there is no ability to walk out into the street. You can, but you have to be heavily armed because everyone else is armed. There is no running water, which means there's no toilets, there's no sanitation facilities, there is no courts, there is no recourse to an authority greater than yourself. And that a country has experienced this sense of lawlessness for a decade. You can't turn on a tap. You can't light a light switch. And in the midst of it, they send the United Nations to bring peace. They send the United Nations to bring order. When you see men and women who are willing to die on the street for a scrap of bread, when you see one man's act of charity becomes another man's death sentence. I had an experience, it was close to Christmas. And I was asked to go from the camp we were in. Camp is a very liberal term. I was with the Canadian Airborne Regiment, and so paratroop troops always live in very austere facilities. You don't carry tents on your back and all those sorts of things. So our cantonment was actually very, very small but heavily armed. And I had run out a host to celebrate Mass with, some of the religious things I need as a Catholic. And so the Americans who were next to us said, well, we have a convoy going into the city of Mogadishu, and we think there's another Catholic priest. You can get what you need to celebrate Mass for Christmas. So I'm going to celebrate the birth of the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ incarnate. So I need the things to do that in my tradition. And so we get in a convoy of Humvees and heavily armored vehicles, and we race towards the city of Mogadishu. Now, I say race because if you slow down, the Somalis would take children who were going to die anyways, and they would roll them under the vehicle wheels. And you had two options. It's very sort of binary. The vehicle keeps rolling, the child is crushed horribly, or you stop. You stop, the vehicle is swarmed. So someone is going to die. It just is a question of whom. In the vehicle with me is a driver, a gunnery sergeant from the Marines, a Baptist chaplain, and myself. All of us are heavily armed, and there's no doors in the vehicle. And you're right, I'm not supposed to be armed, but I don't particularly want to die. So the plan was we would throw out things from, you Americans call them MREs, rations. We'd throw out parts of rations. And of course, in my mind, I'm doing this because I need to go get things to celebrate the birth of the Savior. And the Baptist chaplain, who's never dealt with a gun in his life, is now trying to figure out how to work the friggin' thing. And I'm thinking he's probably going to shoot me through the head before somebody else does. It's okay to say that word, I didn't swear. So anyways, what ended up happening is that at one point we were throwing out crackers, biscuits that were sealed in plastic. And I remember throwing them out the vehicle to move the children away from the vehicle. And this little kid picked it up, as little kids do. I mean, soldiers and little kids are synonymous, like soldiers and puppies and dogs. I mean, we get along very well. The little kid picked it up and started to run. And another larger kid behind him was running behind him, but with a piece of rebar. And he used the rebar to drive it through his skull and kill him instantly so that he could have the biscuits. Ironically, I probably could have used those biscuits to celebrate Mass with. I mean, it was unleavened bread. And I thought, this is wrong. We're here to bring peace. Everything we are, my whole language, my theology, my understanding of the world. And I don't say that to say, well, what a terrible, desperate situation. I say it because it is a microcosm of the world where we can have all the best of intentions and do what we think is the right thing. But if it's not thought out with faith and reason, we run the risk of doing some very terrible things, all in the right cause. I came back from Somalia, a noticeably changed priest, and within 6 months, because of the tempo of operations, I found myself in the midst of the Serbo-Croat War. And by the midst of the Serbo-Croat War, how peacekeeping is done, or peacemaking as this operation was, and for those of you familiar with the United Nations, it's called very dark blue. The United Nations has 2 types of operations. Light blue, which would be peacekeeping along the lines of Cyprus, and dark blue, which is where you have to make the peace first, peacemaking. We used to call it war, but war doesn't sell well in many countries of the world, so we can't use those terms. So literally, the Canadians, the Poles, the Jordanians, and the Kenyans stood between the Croats on one side of the line and the Serbs on the other. So we received fire from both sides. And gradually, within a period of months, in the middle of the war, to push them apart so that the good